I once asked Grok what the Nazca lines were, and who had finished counting them. The answer was simple. Ancient drawings scraped into a Peruvian desert 2,000 years ago, roughly 430 figures found across a century of flights and satellites. Their purpose argued over, but the catalog essentially closed. Then a machine looked at the same sand. In 2024, an artificial intelligence was pointed at that desert, and in 6 months, it gave up 303 more, nearly doubling in a single season what 100 years of searching had found. But it was not the number that unsettled the people who study this place. It was what the new figures showed, where exactly they sat, who they had been drawn for. And the truth the desert had been keeping was stranger and far closer to the ground than anyone had thought. To understand what the machine found, you have to understand the ground it was reading. The Nazca Desert is not a place that invites anyone to stay. It sits inland from the southern coast of Peru, a high tableland lifted some 500 meters above the sea, a plain of reddish stone and gravel running flat to the horizon. Roughly 50 kilometers separate it from the water. It is one of the driest places on the entire planet. Rain almost never comes. In some years, it does not come at all. The sun bakes the surface, the air stays still, and the whole expanse holds a silence that feels less like emptiness and more like waiting. Everything about it says that nothing delicate could survive here for long. And yet the opposite is true, and the reason is the very harshness that seems so hostile. This is a desert built to preserve. The ground is covered in a layer of small stones, darkened over untold years by iron and manganese, a rusted crust laid across paler earth beneath. Below that dark skin, the soil turns light, almost yellow, rich in gypsum. And that simple arrangement, dark stone above and pale ground below, is the whole secret of what was done here. Because a person did not need paint to make a mark on this plain. They needed only to move the stones. Scrape back the dark surface pebbles, clear a shallow channel, and the light ground underneath is exposed like a line drawn in reverse. No pigment, no carving deep into rock. Just the removal of a thin crust to reveal the brightness it had been hiding. A shape cleared this way is not built up. It is uncovered. And on almost any other landscape on Earth, a mark that shallow would be gone within a season, washed flat by rain or smoothed away by wind or buried under blowing sand until nothing remained. Here it did not go. The rain that erases such things never fell. The wind that buries them barely stirs. The climate of the Pampa is dry and stable and very nearly still, and so a scratch pressed into the surface 2,000 years ago stayed almost exactly where it was made. The stones that were pushed aside stayed aside. The pale channels stayed pale. Generation after generation passed, and empires rose and fell in other parts of the world, and the shallow drawings on this Peruvian plain simply held their shape, kept intact by the same dead air and absent rain that made the place unlivable. The desert that would not sustain a crop turned out to be the perfect keeper of a line. So think of the Pampa as a kind of vault. Not a vault of stone walls and locked doors, but one made of climate, of dryness and stillness and the long refusal of the sky to send down water. Into that vault, people once placed an enormous body of work, drawing shape after shape across the open ground, and the vault held it. It held the giant figures that a later age would learn to recognize, and it held far more than that, faint and small and scattered, waiting in the stillness for eyes that could finally take them in. And that is the strange tension at the center of this whole story. The Nazca Desert preserved almost everything that was ever drawn on it. Almost nothing was truly lost to time. The marks were still there, sitting in the open, exposed to the sky, hidden by nothing but their own faintness and the sheer size of the plain they were spread across. What was lost was not the drawings. It was the ability to see them all, to count them, to stand far enough back to take in a record too vast for any person on the ground to hold in a single view. For 100 years, that was the wall. The desert had kept its drawings with a patience nothing else could match, and it kept them still, holding out two things it would not surrender easily: the true number of the figures scratched into its surface, and the reason, after all this time, that anyone had drawn them there at all. For most of human history, no one saw them at all. That is the first strange thing about the Nazca figures. They sit in the open, uncovered, exposed to the sky for 2,000 years, and yet a person standing among them sees almost nothing. Up close, a line in the desert is just a shallow channel of pale ground, running off further than the eye can follow. The giant shapes these lines form are so large that they cannot be read from the surface. You have to be above them, and for nearly all of the time they existed, there was no way for anyone to get above them at all, so they waited for flight. In 1927, a Peruvian archaeologist named Toribio Mejia Chespe noticed the lines while crossing the foothills that overlook the plain, catching the shapes from an angle high enough to hint at what they were. But it was the aeroplane that truly opened them. As pilots began crossing the pampa, the drawings resolved beneath them into something no ground survey had ever revealed: a hummingbird with its wings spread wide, a monkey with a spiraled tail, a spider, a whale, a figure with a rounded head that later watchers would nickname the astronaut. Enormous, deliberate, unmistakable, and visible in full only from the sky. In 1994, the site was named a World Heritage Landscape, a place recognized as belonging to all of humanity. The people who made them were not a mystery in the way the figures were. They were the Nazca, a culture of Peru's southern coast who flourished for roughly 8 centuries, from around 200 years before the Common Era to about 600 years after it. They came after and inherited much from an earlier people called the Paracas, and they built their ceremonial heart at a place called Cahuachi, a complex of mounds and open plazas raised from the desert itself. They were potters and weavers and farmers working a thin margin of watered land in one of the harshest environments people have ever chosen to inhabit. And across the plain above their valleys, over generations, they cleared the dark stones and drew. So the how was never truly the puzzle. Anyone who understood the desert could see how a figure was made, the pushing aside of the crust, the exposing of the pale ground, a technique simple enough that a single person could begin one with their hands. The marks themselves showed the method plainly. What the marks could not show was the thing that mattered most. They could not say why. A line in the ground records the act of its own making and nothing else. It does not explain the intention behind it. It does not name the purpose it was meant to serve. The technique was visible, the reason was not. And the reason was a genuinely hard question, because these were not small gestures. Some of the figures stretch across hundreds of feet. The lines run for kilometers, straight as anything surveyed with instruments, crossing the plain with a discipline that took planning and labor and the coordination of many hands over long stretches of time. People do not do that idly. A society that pours generations of effort into marks it can barely see from the ground is telling us something. The trouble was that the marks would not say what. Who were they drawn for? What were they meant to do? What did a whale scraped into a desert mean to the people who cleared it? And there was a deeper difficulty still, one that shaped every attempt to answer. No one knew how many there were. The figures were faint and scattered across a plain far too large for any person to walk in full. And so the record everyone was trying to explain was incomplete before the explaining even began. People were reasoning about a picture with most of its pieces still hidden in the stillness. For 100 years, every theory about the purpose of the Nazca lines rested on a fraction of the lines themselves. Every answer was a guess dressed as a conclusion, built on a desert whose full contents no one had ever actually seen. And so the guesses came, one after another, each reaching for the same missing thing. The earliest serious answer looked upward. An American historian named Paul Kosok, crossing the Pampa in the 1940s, watched a line seem to meet the setting sun near the winter solstice and called the desert the largest astronomy book in the world. The idea took hold, and it found its greatest champion in a German-born mathematician, Maria Reiche, who came to the plain and never really left it. For decades, she measured and mapped the figures by hand, arguing that the lines formed a vast calendar written into the ground, a way of tracking the sun and the stars and the turning of the agricultural year. She became known as the Lady of the Lines, and it is no small thing to say that her work is much of the reason the site survived at all. She fought to protect it when few others cared, but the calendar itself did not hold. As other researchers came with the tools of archaeoastronomy, the alignments Reiche had seen began to dissolve under scrutiny. Gerald Hawkins tested the lines against the sky and found little there. Anthony Avini went further, and by around 1990, the conclusion had settled among specialists that the figures showed no statistically meaningful match with the solstices, the equinoxes, or the bright stars. On a plane crossed by hundreds of lines running in every direction, a few will always point at something in a sky full of objects. That is coincidence, not design. The astronomical reading did not vanish entirely, but it was reclassified from established fact to something softer, a symbolic possibility rather than a proven system. Other answers turned from the sky to the water, and these fit the desert better. Researchers, including Johann Reinhard, noticed that the lines often gather and converge at the places where water enters the valleys, the springs, and the channels that meant survival on a plain this dry. In this reading, the figures were bound up with the calling of water, with offerings made to the mountain, and water powers the Nazca understood as governing rain and fertility. It should be said clearly that this describes what these people believed and how they saw their world, a documented way of understanding the land, not a claim that any deity answered them. But as an account of why the effort mattered, water made a kind of sense that stars never quite had. On a plain where water was everything, the lines pointed to where it came. And then there were the answers that pointed nowhere the evidence could follow. The plain drew fantasists as surely as it drew scholars. A writer named Erich von Däniken proposed that the long straight lines were runways, landing strips laid down for visitors from elsewhere in the cosmos. Others fixed on the elongated skulls found in nearby burials and insisted they belonged to something not human, to migrants from distant continents or beings from beyond the earth. None of it survived contact with the actual record. The straight lines were made by people who left their tools and their pottery beside them. The shaped skulls are a documented practice of binding an infant's head, found in cultures around the world, and the people they belonged to were native to the Americas, as their own remains attest. These stories persist because the desert is strange, and the temptation to make it stranger is strong. But they explain nothing, and they never did. So there stood the field, crowded with theories and short on certainty. Astronomy, tested and largely set aside. Water and ritual, plausible and partial. And a fringe of fantasy that answered the mystery by inventing a bigger one. Every serious account ran into the same wall, and it was not a wall of imagination. It was a wall of evidence. No one had the full map. No one knew how many figures the desert actually held, or what most of them even depicted, and so every theory was built on a fraction of the record, arguing about the meaning of a picture whose greater part was still lying out on the plain, faint and uncounted, waiting for something that could finally see it whole. The thing that could finally see it whole was not a person. For decades, the search had run into the same limit, and it was a human limit. The Pampa is enormous, hundreds of square kilometers of stone and gravel, and the faint figures scattered across it are exactly the kind of thing a tired eye slides past. A Japanese archaeologist named Masato Sakai, working through the Yamagata University team that had studied this desert for years, understood the problem better than most. He and his colleagues had spent a long time doing it the hard way, crossing the plain, flying drones, poring over high-resolution images captured from the air, finding a handful of new figures for every season of effort. At that rate, a complete map of the desert was not years away. It was generations away. The plain was simply too large for people to read in full, so they handed the reading to a machine. Working with artificial intelligence researchers at the IBM Thomas J. Watson Research Center, Sakai's team built a system and trained it on the geoglyphs already known, teaching it what a Nazca figure looks like from above, the shape of a cleared line against the surrounding stone. Then they turned it loose on the imagery of the desert and let it hunt. What a person did slowly and imperfectly, scanning frame after frame for a faint disturbance in the gravel, the model did at a pace no human scanner could match, flagging possible figures roughly 20 times faster than the old way of looking. And it worked. In the field seasons of 2022 and 2023, ground crews went out to check what the machine had marked, walking to each location, photographing it, confirming with their own eyes and their own drones what the AI had only suspected. When the counting was done, they had verified 303 new figurative geoglyphs. The number is worth sitting with. It had taken nearly a century of patient work to find the 430 figures known before. This nearly doubled that total in a matter of months. The team published the result in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the autumn of 2024, and the scale of it landed at once. A desert everyone thought was largely mapped had been holding half its record in plain sight. But the machine was not a miracle, and it is worth being honest about what it actually did. It did not see the figures the way a person sees them. It guessed, constantly, and most of its guesses were wrong. For roughly every 36 candidates the model flagged, only about one turned out to be a real geoglyph. The rest were shadows, natural marks in the stone, patterns that meant nothing. The AI did not replace the archaeologists. It pointed them, narrowing an impossible search down to a list worth walking, and then the people still had to go out into the desert and do the confirming by hand. The machine found where to look. It could not decide what was true. And there was a further limit, one the researchers themselves were quick to name. Karsten Lambers, an archaeologist who studies exactly this problem, pointed out that a system trained on the figures we can already see will naturally be best at finding more of the same, the clearer ones, the better preserved ones, the low-hanging fruit of the desert. The faintest figures, the ones worn down almost to nothing, are still the hardest to catch, and many of them are almost certainly still out there, below the threshold of what the model can yet recognize. Even after this, the map was not complete. Around 250 more candidates flagged by the AI still sit unverified, waiting for crews to reach them. So the machine had broken the wall that 100 years of human searching could not. It had nearly doubled the record and proven the desert far fuller than anyone believed. But the number, staggering as it was, turned out not to be the real discovery at all. The revelation was not how many figures the AI found. It was what those figures were, and where precisely they had been placed. Because the new figures were not simply more of the same. When the team looked closely at what the machine had helped them find, a division came into focus that had been hard to see before, and it changed the question entirely. The Nazca had not made one kind of drawing. They had made two, and the two were not variations on a single idea. They differed in size, in subject, and in where they were placed. And once that split was clear, so was something no theory of stars or single purpose had ever managed to explain. The famous giants, the hummingbird and the whale and the spider, belong to one kind. These are the line-type figures, drawn with a single continuous outline, large enough to demand the sky, more often depicting wild creatures. They are the ones the aeroplanes revealed, the ones that made the desert famous. But most of what the AI turned up belonged to the other kind, and that kind had gone largely uncounted precisely because it was smaller and fainter and easier to miss. These are the relief-type figures, and they are a different thing altogether. The relief figures are small. They are worn low into the surface rather than outlined across it, and their subjects are overwhelmingly human. When the researchers tallied what these figures showed, more than 8 in 10 depicted people or the things bound up with human life, domesticated animals, figures in action, and severed human heads. Where the giant line figures reach for wild nature seen from above, the relief figures are crowded with human beings and the world they made. And their placement was the detail that broke the mystery open. The relief figures were not scattered at random across the plain. They cluster along the winding footpaths that thread the desert, sitting on average within about 43 meters of a trail, close enough to walk past, close enough to see from the ground, on foot, without any need to rise into the air at all. That single fact overturns a century of assumption. The whole enduring strangeness of the Nazca lines was that they seemed to be made for a viewer who could not exist. An eye in the sky the Nazca had no way to reach. But the relief figures were never meant for that eye. They were made to be seen exactly the way the people who made them would have seen them, walking the paths of their own desert, passing figure after figure set beside the route. They were, in the plainest sense, things to be looked at while moving through the land. The researchers described them as a way of sharing something with whoever walked by, a record of human activity placed along the roads of human travel. And that gives the two kinds of figure two entirely separate lives. The small relief figures beside the paths were intimate, made and seen at the scale of a single person or a small group, a kind of message left along a route for others to read on their way. The giant line figures were something else, communal and ceremonial, tied to the wider network of straight lines and trapezoids that runs toward the great ritual center at Cahuachi, figures built and used by the whole community rather than glimpsed by a passing traveler. One kind spoke to the individual on the road, the other belonged to the gathered people and their sacred ground. It has to be said carefully what this means and what it does not. This is a reading of how the Nazca understood and used their own landscape, a documented picture of their world and its ceremonies, not a claim that any of their beliefs were true in the way they held them to be. But as an account of purpose, it is the firmest the desert has ever given. The lines were not one puzzle with one answer. They were at least two things doing two different kinds of work. And the machine had made that visible by finding the smaller, humbler, more human half that had always been there and had never been counted. And within that human half sat one figure stranger than the rest, a killer whale with a blade in its grip, standing beside a path where anyone could see it. It is roughly 22 meters long, and it is holding a knife. An orca, a killer whale, scraped into the desert surface and set near one of the ancient footpaths, its body carrying a blade the way a person carries a tool. On its own, it might read as a strange flourish, a sea creature drawn far inland by people who lived within reach of the coast. But it does not stand on its own, and that is what makes it hard to look away from. It sits inside a whole vocabulary of images the relief figures kept returning to, and once you see what that vocabulary is, the whale with the knife stops being strange and becomes something closer to a statement. Masato Sakai, who led the survey, did not have to guess at what the orca meant because the Nazca left the same image elsewhere. On their pottery, painted in the workshops of the same culture, there are scenes of orcas holding knives and severing human heads. The desert figure and the painted vessel are speaking the same language. And so Sakai reads the orca not as decoration, but as a being tied to human sacrifice, a creature the Nazca understood as an agent of killing, carried out of their pottery and pressed into the ground beside a road. The blade in its grip is not incidental. It is the point. And the orca does not stand alone in that. Among the human subjects the machine helped uncover, one motif recurs with a frequency that is difficult to ignore: severed heads. Decapitated human heads appear again and again in the relief figures, drawn into the surface along the paths, part of that overwhelming majority of images concerned with people and what was done to them. This connects to something already known about the Nazca from their graves and their art, a practice of taking and keeping human heads, what researchers have long called trophy heads, preserved and carried and buried as objects of ritual power. It has to be said plainly that this describes what the Nazca believed and did within their own world, a documented practice of their culture set down here as their record of themselves and not as anything endorsed. But the record is unmistakable. The heads are there over and over, scratched into the plain. Put the pieces together, and the picture that emerges is not the one a century of theories had reached for. These roadside figures were not a calendar of the stars. They were not, most of them, a map of the heavens or a message for the sky. They were a record of the Nazca's own world, and a great deal of that world was violent. The blade, the whale that kills, the taken head, all of it placed deliberately along the routes where people walked, where a traveler would pass one image and then another and read. In the ground beneath their feet, the ritual and the killing and the beliefs that governed their lives. It is closer to signage than to astronomy, a visual language of a people's cosmology, laid out beside the road for those who move through it. That is a colder and more human thing than the mystery the desert had worn for so long. The romance of the Nazca lines was always the eye in the sky, the sense of a message aimed upward at something we could not name. What the smaller figures show instead is a society drawing its own preoccupations at ground level, and those preoccupations ran to sacrifice and severed heads and creatures that carried blades. The desert had not been keeping a riddle about the stars. It had been keeping a portrait, and the portrait had a knife in it. And yet, even as the picture grows sharper, it grows more fragile. The same survey that revealed all this also made plain how much still sits beyond reach, how much has already worn away, and how quickly what remains is being lost. For every figure the machine confirmed, the desert holds others fading toward nothing, and the record that took 2,000 years to survive is now, in its final century of legibility, beginning to disappear. Return to the desert and to the drawings it kept. 2,000 years of dryness and stillness, holding shallow marks in the stone the way nothing else on earth could. For 100 years the story was fixed. Around 430 figures, an astronomical mystery aimed at the sky, a catalog thought nearly closed. Then a machine read the plain and found it twice as full, a purpose that splits in two, intimate messages beside the paths and ceremonial giants above them, left by a people who then vanished into a valley they had stripped of its trees. It does not rewrite the whole of human history. It rewrites how we read the Nazca and why they drew, and that is enough. And the sand still holds 250 more, unconfirmed, eroding, waiting now the way the first 430 waited to be seen.